as we continue shifting into the industrial side of things, we sort of started to see it with the inventions that helped the homesteaders with their way of life. Our next topic is railroads. Now, the idea of a railroad that linked east and west is really decades old, but the California Gold Rush of 1849 shifted the proposed terminus of the route to San Francisco Bay, and it was the thousands of Missouri miners who walked to California and didn't want to walk back that really started making the most noise. Private construction of the entire line would take decades to recoup, but the idea began to be floated that if the federal government shared in the costs, then success could be achieved. The Republican Party adopted the so-called idea of a Pacific Railroad into its platform in 1856, and was consistent with their idea that the federal government could indirectly help the American people by assisting American business. And oddly enough, it was a Democrat, Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who was one of the first national figures to propose such a route, and that's why he authored the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Lawyer turned businessman Leland Stanford had gone to California at the request of his brother to build his wealth as a result of the gold rush, and he went to Washington in 1861 to lobby for a railroad on behalf of several prominent California Republicans. Now, he was in charge of the Central Pacific Railroad that connected Sacramento to Promontory Point, Utah. The other side was the Union Pacific, led by Thomas Durant, who would connect Omaha to Promontory Point. The South had previously pushed for a southern route for a transcontinental railroad, but Southern legislators pulled out of Congress with the onset of the Civil War, and thus the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 authorized the construction of that northern route from the Missouri River to California. The federal government agreed to finance the project with 30-year bonds and 6% interest and land grants. The Central and Union Pacific received the contracts. Now, a project of this scale had never been attempted before, so nobody knew if the American people would be able to recoup the cost, because the American people are technically the ones that are helping to finance it. Gathering the necessary manpower to construct the railroad was one of the largest issues that each company needed to deal with after figuring out funding, due mainly to the potential wealth of the California Gold Rush. Over 25,000 Chinese had immigrated to the United States by 1851, and more were still coming. Once California moved past the phase where gold was the main economic driver, the Chinese moved into other industries, and they became very interested when ads were posted looking for laborers for the Central Pacific Railroad. There was an initial hesitance and, in fact, a prejudice that faced these Chinese workers. But one of the financial backers of the project boldly stated, didn't they build the Chinese wall? And that was really all it took to convince the other backers to maybe give the Chinese workers a shot. Now, when given the chance, it was discovered that Chinese workers not only used the expertise that they had gained in constructing bridges along the Changjiang River in China. They used this to help carve a roadbed from a mountain of stone. They not only used previous expertise, but they ended up being more efficient than the European immigrant force that built the Union Pacific line. However, their efficiency, their work ethic, and their expertise didn't stop them from facing significant discrimination the entire time. And this is why, in the famous image at Promontory Point where the golden spike was hammered, not a single Chinese worker is pictured. Besides keeping workers happy and paying them in a timely manner, the Union Pacific dealt with attacks by the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, who judged that the iron road being laid on their lands were permanent, as opposed to previous covered wagons that were just passing by. The Union Pacific was eventually able to keep construction moving past the most dangerous zones where attacks would occur, while the Central Pacific dealt with having to lay track through the mountains. They used a relatively new invention called nitroglycerin, which was invented in Italy only 2 decades earlier to accomplish the task. And it was much more efficient than using black powder like was used for the Erie Canal. They also had to contend with snows in the Sierra Nevada mountains. So they began constructing snow sheds like you see here. And these snow sheds kept the tracks clear of ice and snow, and many of them ultimately became permanent. Now here's the aforementioned image. The meeting point for the 2 lines was fixed at Promontory Point, Utah, in early May. The final golden spike was to be hammered in by President Grant, and he actually missed on the first try, but the Associated Press cabled out that it was finished. The first Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, connecting east and west. Church bells rang out in New York and Boston. The Liberty Bell rang in Philly. San Francisco had a parade, while Washington, D.C. celebrated with cannon fire. It was heralded as a sign of progress and an example of what Americans could accomplish with industry and a can-do attitude. Canada's version of a railroad like this was completed in 1885, and the Russians would follow suit with their own Trans-Siberian Railway, completed in 1912. But again, when you look at this famous image, not a single Chinese worker from the Central Pacific is pictured. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad understandably gets the most press, but overall, as seen with this railroad, when you look at different themes, railroads were often constructed as partnerships between the federal government and private business. The subsidies provided to the Union and Central Pacific got the ball rolling, and others eventually followed suit. James J. Hill of the Great Northern Railroad, which connected the upper Midwest, the Great Plains, and the Pacific Northwest, and Hill and other private businessmen were more than willing to settle immigrants along their railways because they knew that they would utilize them. They also invested in agricultural and livestock research amongst their routes, and they even came up with a national standard for track size. So we got 4 feet by 8.5 inches. 8.5 inches deep, 4 feet long, or 4 feet wide. This is the same size as a Roman road, and this is still in play today. Many railroads were built specifically to showcase the West. A town that was a stop along the railroad could 100% count on increasing its population. The railroads were also designed to increase attendance at the new national parks, such as Yellowstone, which opened up in 1869. In nearly every town along the way, the center of life shifted from the market to the rail station. Since each railroad was wired in, each station would have a telegraph office. So this is where the residents of the town would gather to hear information and get news off the Associated Press wire. To ensure reliability in terms of arrival and departure, the railroads adopted this new concept known as time zones in the 1880s. And you see the time zones on screen. And the rest of the country ultimately followed suit. And finally, as we have previously seen, the buffalo was hunted nearly to the extinction, although all told the buffalo were on their way to having this happen. It's just that building the Transcontinental and all of the other railroads that you see here simply sped up the process.